Oh my goodness, how's everyone doing out there in podcast land? Today on Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast, myself, Jeff Black, Brandon DeCruz. We're joined again by Ed Helms, our man crush that we just can't get enough of over here in America. But today we're going to talk about episode 36, training considerations to maximize muscle growth, volume, intensity, frequency, all the good shit in between. But first, a real quick recap, Brandon, since Eric and all of us are kind of on a tighter timeline than normal of how our last 7 days have been, and we'll get into the weeds of this.
Yeah, man, I'm going to keep it real short. It's been a great week on my end. For anyone that's familiar with the IFBB Pro season, next week is the Olympia. So this was the last active week of the competitive season. And I had one of my long-term clients, Arturo Turner, actually compete in his first IFBB Open Men's Physique Pro Show, which was the Battle of Texas down in Irving. And, Arturo and I have been working together. This is our third season working together, third show. And he had previously turned pro in a master's category. So we're trying to make the transition over into open. We put on 10 or 8 pounds of tissue since last November. So I'm really proud with him in that. But I got to tell you, I know this is going to sound shocking, even for Jeff over here, but especially Eric, I'm sure this will come to a shock to you, but think about it like this. He's an Opens men's physique pro, 6'1", 217 pounds on stage. Still wasn't big enough. So
not surprising anymore.
It's evolved to a level where these guys are bigger than the classic guys. So it was something that it was eye-opening to say the least, and we have much more work to do, but I'm really proud of him for making that debut. He's also an active police officer. He works the night shift. So actually some of the things we spoke about with Danny Lennon last week about chrononutrition, night shift work, things of that, circadian misalignment are things that I've integrated with him and I've looked into as a result of having worked with him for so long. But, I want to keep this short. Other than that, business has been going well, training's going well. And I'm just happy to have one of my favorite guys on the podcast. You are the number one downloaded. So I got to give you that number one downloaded podcast that we've ever had, Eric. So we got to go 2 for 2. We're trying to outdo our last one. So let's see if we can make it happen.
I almost wish he was shirtless for this one, so that way people would tune into the YouTube channel. Oh yeah, there we go. Get some skin.
He is making his bodybuilding return, so maybe he'll
take the pub cover off. Fuck it, we don't need it. We're good, B man. That's some good stuff. I'll be interested as we get into this episode. If anything we go over today, you put into play to make that happen. Let's see. Everything's been good on my end the last 7 days. I'm on a hard deadline to hit my book. Editing a book is nowhere near as fun as writing a book, I found out. So I've gone from 97,000 words down to 65,000. I've yet to put the intro in. I'm waiting to put the intro in, but Steven Pressfield, who wrote The War of Art, Turning Pro, Legend Bag Advance, he meets me every month and we kind of go over stuff. And he gave me a good quote is you can't fix everything in the first draft. And you can't fix everything in one draft. So he goes through his book 17, 18 times before he'll turn them over. So I've gotten really good. And what's interesting is when you write, I think Eric can appreciate this because he's written a couple books now. You can look back and go, God, I was a shitty writer in the beginning. Oh, I kind of got better. Ooh, I got better. And by the end, you're not editing as much because you can see you got clearer, more concise, and you just kind of understood where to go. Like the muse, as Steven says, the gods took you where you needed to go and you wrote. So I've been working on that. That's taken a lot of my time, but I can say this, man, if you're out there, and I don't know, I'll be curious about your thoughts on this, Eric, you could chime in before we get into your 7 days. I think writing a book single-handedly is the hardest thing I've ever done. In terms of just sheer discipline, to have to commit myself to sit down to do it when there are 40,000 other things to do as a business owner that I feel like I should have been doing. And it was a really interesting lesson into how deep I was willing to go with myself to give an authentic piece of work to people that I knew I could be proud of no matter what. I could be like, nope, in that time of my life when you read that, that was me. That was how I felt. That is what I believed. And there's a certain conviction you get from that. It's almost like you kind of get like this, you've arrived moment, but there's still much more to go. Like you can see even more now. So I'll be curious. What do you think about that, Eric? My little thought there, since you've written a few books.
It is very, very, very challenging to write books. And I've written a master's thesis, a PhD, and a couple books. And I've helped others do the same. Obviously, I supervise a lot of PhD and master's students. And make no mistake, a PhD, like, for example, one of my students, his name is Ivan Jukic. He just submitted his PhD for examination. And if you include references, that sucker clocked in at close to 110,000 words. So they are books. And the way that I was able to write the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, I kind of cheated because I had Andrea and Andy help me. I recruited them because I knew how hard it would be. And they basically transcribed the videos that I did back in 2012 and 13 for the nutrition, and then 14 and 15 for the training, and then helped me organize them. And then I basically took in front of me my own words that I already had audio recorded that were transcribed and just edited for, audio mistakes and things like that, and then wrote on top of them. So I had a skeleton at the start. I think the key aspects that I found are useful for writing is creating an outline and knowing where you're trying to go, and from a big picture level, where it's very difficult to start going at all. And that was already done for me. So if you told me, hey, Eric, you have to just write a book from scratch, I think that would be a exponentially more challenging process. So a big respect for anybody who can do it.
100%, man. I went to a scribe workshop where we talked about that, and they stressed so much that if you did not have an outline, like a table of contents, that you'd be buried before you even started. And a lot of that's why they say, 100 people start a book, one person actually finishes writing it. It's the numbers of that is even lower than doing a bodybuilding show. Like, I remember the first year I was competing in 2006, everyone in the gym's like, there's like 10 dudes. And by the end of it, it's like Clint and I, and we're just looking at each other like, I guess we're just going to go put this banana hammock on and try it. You know what I mean? So I appreciate that insight, man. And I think that's interesting to hear how you put together your set of books going forward. So with that being said, how's your last 7 days been before we get into this?
They have been good. Yeah. A big part of it was actually working on that thesis, helping, Yvonne put a polish on his amazing work.
What's it on?
Yeah, he is specifically looking at different ways of improving velocity-based monitoring for resistance training. Oh. So he did some very intense critiques of some of the methods like velocity loss. Does that actually produce reliable differences in fatigue? Or is it 20% velocity loss that we think is, it's good for strength and power? Yeah, but what RIR does that put you at? And it's actually quite variable between individuals, session to session, set to set. And there are more issues with some of these kind of like good evidence-based strategies than we think. So then the question is, how do we improve upon them? So maybe instead of using a percentage-based velocity loss, we use an absolute velocity stop, kind of like the velocity associated with a specific RIR. And we can also get to the same outcome of having a certain amount of velocity loss without necessarily needing to get a velocity tracker, and doing something like a cluster set or a rest redistribution set structure, where you're simply taking the rest you would normally have between sets and putting it between reps so that you can maintain a high velocity if the goal is, power for, let's say, like a team sport athlete or something like that. He also looked at like the reliability of the different devices as we move from tethered rotary encoders or linear position transducers to accelerometers, which are becoming cheaper, more common, and advertised to the general strength conditioning community rather than the sports scientists. Are those actually as reliable and valid as we think they are? So he titled his PhD velocity-based training, "The Good, the Bad, and the Alternatives." So I think it's a really, really cool and very in-depth look at resistance training monitoring prescription, including some of the typical velocity-based measures, and maybe how we can move forward and improve that even more.
I can't wait to actually read that.
Well, it's only 100,000 words, so it'll be an easy read. So
yeah, I should get through that in 3 days at the rate I read.
There you go.
All right, let's get into this. So we're going to talk about training considerations. We talk about, so there's 4 primary programming variables for building muscle: volume, proximity to failure, frequency, intensity, and relative load. So with that being said, Brandon, I'm going to turn it to you and let you start break through. And then I'm going to chime in because I'm old school bodybuilder. I got this shit in 95 when Lee Priest was talking about doing 7 sets per exercise, 35 sets of workout, and that's what I grew up on. That's what I grew on up until I injured my hip and had to really rechange my training this year. So I'm very interested to see what compelling information there is for an old school dogmatic bodybuilder like myself to say, hey, I want to jump in on this. So B, I'm going to turn it over to you on this, man.
Let's do it. All right. So in today's show, we wanted to bring Eric on to discuss the primary programming variables that we should be considering when it comes to training for maximizing muscle growth. And these, like Jeff alluded to, are going to include volume, proximity to failure, frequency, and intensity or relative load, like load on the bar. And there's a reason why I wanted to bring Eric on. I told him this through an email privately, but there are a lot of individuals in this space who create content regarding hypertrophy training. But something that I really appreciate about you, Eric, and I've shared this privately with you, is you not only have an incredible grasp of the literature, the most up-to-date, what the research says, but also you have this ability to present it in an extremely unbiased perspective. It's not clouded by your attachment to any one approach or ideology, or that you're trying to sell something. And that's something that's really lacking in this industry, unfortunately. And then also, when it really comes down to evidence-based practice, it's supposed to consider what the body of the evidence states, the experience of the coach who's implementing the principles at hand, but it also considers the abilities and also the constraints, especially from a lifestyle perspective, of the individual client we're working with. And often I find that even those who claim to be evidence-based forget to consider the inter-individual differences between people, as well as the fact that what's considered, optimal for one person or one client may not be optimal or may not even be feasible for another person. So we really have to think about, I always say that my goal is to bridge the gap between optimality and practicality, because even if we went for what's optimal in a meta-analysis, if that person can't implement it into their lifestyle or can't do it consistently, it's not optimal for them, because they're never going to get to where they want to be. And honestly, from a psychological perspective, thinking that these constraints where they have to do something, it might just have a nocebo effect on them. So, really kick off this conversation, I'd like to start with discussing training volume, which has, honestly, and I know you've been a part of a lot of these, it's been a highly contested or debated topic going back and forth, especially since, Schoenfeld's meta-analysis in 2017, where the concept of counting volume by counting the amount of hard sets was kind of cemented as a standard. And so when it comes to training for hypertrophy, we have a lot of differing opinions on how much volume, or aka how many sets one should perform to maximize muscle growth. And we seem to have, diametrically opposed camps. If we were to just, really break it down into two different groups, we have those in the high intensity, low volume crowd who think that hypertrophy can be maximized by taking one set to absolute failure. And then on the other side or the other end of the spectrum, rather, we have the high volume crowd, which they're more for, let's see how many sets we can do and recover from. And many claim that more sets equal more stimulus and thus will lead to greater growth. So Eric, could you, go through what the research says about training volume for maximizing muscle growth? And not only that, but what have you seen work best in practice? Because it's, remember, and I know you know this, but for the audience out there, research reports averages. So it's, it might be applicable to 95% of the people, but there's always outliers within research. So it's really, I love your grasp of it, that you always consider the individuals as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great tee up. And I think to really support that last point you just made about individual differences, I think is where we need to start, because it highlights the issue with being in one of these diametrically seemingly opposed camps, and the ways that they both get it a little bit wrong to the detriment of everybody. So you mentioned the meta-analysis by Schoenfeld. Big highlight there is that the highest rates or fastest rates of muscle growth seem to occur in the studies where they're doing 10 or more sets per muscle group, right? And importantly, these are all sets that are taken to some definition of failure in the literature, because that's just the predominant way that a lot of these studies on hypertrophy have been done. And I don't think any of the studies in the Schoenfeld meta-analysis were submaximal, at least by the description of the training studies. I could be wrong on that, but we're talking about the vast majority of these studies that were meta-analyzed, training to failure, 10 plus sets per muscle group. That's where the highest level of muscle growth is. I think if you just put a period after that sentence, you have a very unnuanced view. We don't know what were the other comparisons. We don't know what were the actual differences, from an economic perspective. How much of an ROI am I getting from going from, say, 3 sets to 10, more than tripling it? Am I getting more than 3 times the growth? Spoiler alert, the answer is no. But I think to contrast that with a recent study that came out in 2019, which is actually a reanalysis of prior data by DeMoss and colleagues. And what they did was they compared, and this is pretty cool because it's a within subject design, meaning that the individual had a different protocol on one leg versus the other leg. So all the cool things that are confounders when we compare individuals, like their training background, their genetic potential to grow, their nutritional status, who's sleeping, who's not, et cetera, are controlled. And that's all taken care of. And we're looking at what happens in one leg versus what happens in the other. And what they did was they broke the data down. Again, this is a reanalysis, to where they looked at one group that was training, I think, 5 days per week to get to 15 total sets of quadricep training per week, and the other group that was training 2 to 3 days per week to get between 6 to 9 sets. So if we take that and we compare it to the Schoenfeld data, okay, we've got 6 to 9 sets on one leg, which were grouped together in this analysis, and 15 sets. Per our meta-analysis, we would expect that the group that is doing, or I should say the condition, the leg that is doing 15 plus sets would grow more. But in this specific study, there was no significant difference between legs. And when you look at the individual data, we see that there was roughly a 50-50 split, not exactly when you take a look at what was counted as beyond the measurement error for like a true change. But probably a better way to break it down is roughly a third of people seem to do negligibly similar, whichever one they were on. A third of people did better on the lower volume approach, and a third of people did better on the higher volume approach. And if you just look at absolute change, just did it go up or down, it's like a 50-50-ish split between one way or the other. And sometimes that probably does what just was measurement error. Now you could say, oh, but isn't that confounded by frequency? You know, one group's training high frequency, low volume per session. The other one is training moderate frequency, low volume per session. And that's not just a volume comparison. Well, that is probably the case, but important to remember that the Schoenfeld meta-analysis didn't control for frequency. You know, the primary data point we're using is just looking at sets per week. When we use that, the signal from the noise suggests higher volume is better. But that's not saying that that is true for all people in all cases in all situations. And I think the challenge here is people understanding how to interpret this data. And your first thought is, and I think some people who have a rigid view of how to apply science might go, well, a meta-analysis is better than a single study, so I'm going to go with that. Or so the single study was too small of a sample, or it was wrong. No, both of these findings are true and at the same time, because there being a significant mean difference between, you know, two different volume levels in the larger population of lifters is not the same thing as saying that every single person is going to have better results using higher volume. It's just saying that the average, where most people cluster, is probably going to be associated with higher volumes. But that could be, that mean, for example, could come from, half of the people just getting really great gains, but then the other half getting not that great gains, but pretty good gains when they're on a lower volume program. So there's individual magnitudes, and there's also the distribution of how it affects across individuals. Because a mean is taking a large response in one person and a small response in another, a negative response in another, and creating an average. So yeah, if you don't have any other data and you have to sit here and create a program for someone, you can assume that a higher volume versus a lower volume approach would probably have a higher probability of inducing greater gains. But that's not to say that there aren't, say, if we take this DeMoss study at face value, that a third of people that you randomly chose wouldn't do better on a lower volume approach, because for whatever reason, maybe they're just doing too much. Maybe their recovery isn't the same as the average or someone else. So I think having an understanding of what's best on average for everybody is not the same thing as the planning process of setting up a program for someone. And that is something that needs to be individualized every time. And ultimately, that's the disconnect, is we have these null hypothesis testing, population-based mean averages that we can have with a reasonably high precision because they come from, say, a meta-analysis. But that doesn't necessarily tell you what you do, like you, Brandon, when you sit down with your men's physique competitor who's trying to compete in Olympia in 2023 or 2024, and you go, all right, here's how we're going to get you up to 230. We're going to do X, Y, and Z. You don't go, and it's more sets because of this meta-analysis. Yeah, you go, okay, what did we do last year? What did work? What didn't work? What joint pain do we have? What equipment do you have access to? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Every variable you need to tick. And I think that's the big challenge. But it is true what some of the things in both camps say. So if we kind of look at, we go back to that camp analogy, which is, unfortunately, a relatively accurate representation of some people.
Yeah, I hate to dichotomize it like that, but honestly, being in the middle which is where I'm at, Eric. I believe that's most likely where you're at. It's not sexy in the middle. So it's like, it's almost like we see these opposing camps. And even, when there's debates or when there's podcasts where they bring on different people, it's always like this opposing. And a lot of times when we really speak it out and we talk with one another, we realize that there's much more similarities in our approach and our beliefs than there are differences. It's just how people present things, especially if they're selling a product or they have a course or whatever it may be. It's a little bit sexier. There's more sex appeal to it. There's more salesmanship to it. If you stake your claim and you have, a side and a camp and you're able to ride or die by it, and being in the middle and saying, well, it depends, or, this may work for this person, this may work for that. That's really something that a lot of people don't want to admit to being of that camp or of that open-minded ideology where you're like, listen, failure training can work if that fits your, psychological proclivity and your setup, and you only have, a certain very small allocation of time and volume to allot to muscle groups per week. Absolutely. Take it to the house every single set. But if you're someone that's going to train, let's look at if we're going to speak on this later, but if we look at the failure training research, when we actually look at intervention studies on training, they're 2 to 3 days per week. It's not the average bodybuilder training 4 to 6 days per week. So we have to take that into consideration. They're going to failure, whether it be momentary muscular failure or volitional failure, because of the constructs of that 2 to 3 day per week training period. Whereas if we were to extrapolate that out and now double the amount of training sessions per week, do you really think that would be the most conducive, maybe in the short term, but over the long term? And hypertrophy is a long-term game.
So I actually have a question for you guys. I want to chime and get your thoughts, Eric. Immediately, I'm like, okay, I hear all this, but I'm like, the first argument I know that people are going to say is, well, explain to me the golden era bodybuilding when Arnold was doing 6 days a week, 2 times a day. Safe to say he was overtraining based upon what we know, but then how did some of them get those physiques? So where does all this kind of come out in the wash based on volume from what you've seen and all that? And that's why I want to kind of ask you on that, because I'm just curious, because I know our audience, some people listen like me will be like, I don't feel shit if I do 4 sets for biceps. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I gotta go in there and destroy myself to feel like I did it. So is that more of a mentality thing? Is it just bred a bad culture? Where do we kind of go with this?
I'm so glad you asked it from a historical lens, because for those who don't know, I am kind of an amateur historian in this. So the golden era, if you will, I personally think the silver era is the golden era, but to each their own.
I agree with you as well, but we'll go with that.
And that's probably my natty bias, but so at this, actually the time of Arnold is actually when these camps begin forming. So Arthur Jones, a really influential figure. He is the person who created high intensity training.
Mike Menser was the student of his, correct?
Mike Menser was the student. Arthur Jones is also the creator of Nautilus. Mm-hmm. So 2 very, very interesting things came out of this era: the battle between compound exercises and isolation from a philosophical standpoint, the utility of machines, the pushback from, therefore, the athletic and the strength the conditioning community. Hey, we need to be doing, functional training, et cetera, which has become its own complicated, bastardized term. And the idea of doing high intensity, low volume training, and the battle between the 2 poster boys, that have become Arnold versus Menser. And Menser had a pretty damn good physique, Some would argue, he's placing high level in the Olympia. He's not Arnold, but, nobody's Arnold. So it's difficult to just go like, who has a better physique? Obviously, that's not what I'm arguing. And you can find amazing physiques on both sides of it. And this continues to play out all the way through, Dorian Yates versus, other more contemporary, Olympias who use a higher volume approach. Lee Haney and Dorian are another kind of somewhat opposed kind of viewpoint here. Mm-hmm. But I think the answer to your question, I would say, Jeff, is that some people do respond better to higher versus lower volumes. And like you said, I don't feel like I've done it if I don't trash myself on a given day. Mm-hmm. Now,
that's a mentality.
Now, the funny thing is that you can get to trashing yourself through either approach. Have you ever watched some of the old videos of like Arthur Jones making someone do like slow controlled eccentrics on every set of deadlifts?
I have. I've seen the old stuff of his, and then Blood and Guts with Dorian really opened up my mind when my workout partner showed me that. I think it was 97. I'm 17 years old and was like, holy shit. Like, I'm supposed to go 3 extra reps beyond when the bar collapsed on my chest. Whoa, okay. You know what I mean? So, okay.
Yeah. And so, like, if you ask Dorian, what do I do when I plateau? He'd say, you need to find some way to increase intensity, forced reps, and things that don't really do that. Like, like I would say pre-exhaust and then doing it. So there are some interesting decisions that were made based upon adhering to an ideology. But one thing is true, whether you're in the high intensity camp or the high volume camp, you feel like you got to work out if you did it the way these people are proposing. And I think that's a universal thing that culturally is a part of bodybuilding, is you have to feel like you're working hard. And what I often recommend people do is that they just apply the feeling of working hard in maybe a broader context to, say, a microcycle or a mesocycle, or from a philosophical perspective of what's the most efficient and effective way I can construct a training program, and just let the effort be what it is on any given day that's necessary to complete that plan. And I think for people who have a more visceral connection to bodybuilding and started approaching it before they ever thought about planning or science or anything like that, that's somewhat of a hard pill to swallow, that you might have some workouts where you leave the gym feeling fine, and you can see this in like the split-based programs. Like, you might have a shoulders and arms day, and there's almost nothing you can do to really make a shoulders and arms day feel hard. But that's why you do these drop sets, you do supersets. You're like, at least I got a ridiculous pump in my arms, so I know like that's going to grow, even though it's not the blood and guts leg day. So I do think this is somewhat confounded by people's feelings, and I'm always surprised by some of the really nasty responses and extremely emotional things you can see from people when you make content about leaning more towards volume or more towards intensity. And when you see that on something that should be a relatively like non-emotional topic, it's like, wait, did I say something about religion? What happened here? And it's like, oh, that's right. This is connecting to something that is embedded in the culture.
Yeah.
Yeah. So hopefully that answers your question. And I would say
absolutely does.
Cool. Yeah, there is definitely individual differences. Maybe what's useful to do here is to talk about, from like a steel manning perspective, what do these two camps get right? Because I do think they get some things right.
I think that'd be great to talk about.
Let's do it. So first, one of the things you'll hear on the quote unquote intensity side of the camp is that is the pushback against the idea that volume is the primary determinant of hypertrophy or the most influential factor. And they'll say, no, it's intensity. And I think they're right, because the actual thing that starts to stimulate the biochemical cascade that therefore results in hypertrophy is tension at the muscular level. And even if you think, oh, but what about, the potential influence of metabolic factors or muscle damage or satellite swells or myonuclear domain, like none of that happens until you actually lift weights. Everything is a secondary cascade that comes off of that, the hormonal response, the autocrine and paracrine response, right? So the actual process of lifting heavy or hard enough, either to failure or with a high enough load, that actually generates a contraction that puts stress on the costomeres and on the titin molecule that induces the actual process of mechanotransduction that leads to muscle growth. That is intensity. Really, the accurate way of describing it is not volume's the primary determinant of muscle growth, but rather volume is the dose of the intensity you will need to get an appropriate stimulus. And that dose does seem to have a semi-dose response relationship, although it's not linear and it's confounded by many other factors, like all training things are, with hypertrophy. And that's the truth on the other side of the spectrum, right? So it's almost the wrong question to say, is it intensity or volume? The real question is, what volume of this intensity do I need? And I think that kind of flips it on its head, and it makes it very difficult to stay in one of these camps. And then you start to just talk about different doses, right? The intensity folks will say, well, if you're training hard enough, you don't need a very large dose. If you're doing a high volume program, it's because you're not training hard enough. And what they're forgetting is that they're describing somewhat of a circular two-way relationship. You can't benefit from as high of a volume if you're training incredibly hard. And this somewhat tails into proximity to failure, like you were talking about, Brandon.
To elaborate on that, I think that sometimes people within these different camps, they're not really understanding what the research says. So they'll see an infographic on Instagram and they'll say, based on Schoenfeld's meta-analysis 2017, 10 plus sets per week, period, as you alluded to. However, I think it's really important to contextualize that the data we have on sets per week is based on counting sets per muscle per week in a slightly different way than many would. So for example, in that exact 2017 meta-analysis, if someone was doing 5 sets of, say, bench press and 5 sets of incline per week, that would count as 10 sets per week for not only our chests, as most people would count it for, but also our triceps, also our front delts. So a lot of times, I think that people aren't realizing that when they're saying, when we're seeing the evidence on these things, they might be conflating that they're responding better to lower volumes than what is said in the research because of how they count their per week volume, where they're only counting it as direct work. So if they do a tricep pushdown, they're thinking, do I really have to do 10 plus sets per week to optimize this? Not realizing that their pressing volume is what is in the research, that's what's being counted towards it. So I think that a lot of people, they look, and I'm sure you can attest to this, and you've seen this many times, they're only looking at the abstract. And so they only see that conclusion, 10 plus sets per week. And if we really look at it, it was a gradient. There's 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 plus sets per week. And each of them, it wasn't that none of, 1 to 4 or 5 to 9 were ineffective. They just had less of a dose response. And then also when we look at, what some people in the literature will turn to as non-responders or low responders, they're more likely to respond to higher volumes. So sometimes they're in a situation where they're training. And remember, training within these interventions, they're not customized to the individual, which is where I kind of want to allude to or get to is how do we individualize training volume? Because that's something that the literature has been pointing to recently. And that's where my real interest comes to, because I love the research. However, I'm a practitioner. So really when it comes down to it, I'm looking at, all right, what does the broad-based recommendations for volume start? So if I have no information about someone has no training history, they have very little experience. Okay, I could start with 10 sets per week per muscle group, or maybe a little bit lower, 8 to 10 sets per week. However, now I'm looking at different conflating variables. So I'm looking at, the interaction between volume and frequency, also the limit of per session volume. But then I'm also looking at the newer literature that's showing how to individualize training volume. So Eric, if you could, expand upon that, maybe touch on the limit of per session volume. I know that's a meta regression more so than a meta-analysis, but I think there's still some great data that we can take from that.
Yeah. So I 100% agree with everything you said. And just to contextualize it even further, that Schoenfeld meta-analysis, I ran the numbers one time. I just calculated, all right, I looked at what's the effect size of 10 plus sets, and then what is the proportion of that effect size or percentage that the 5 to 9 sets and 1 to 4 were. And it's roughly 2/3 of that effect size doing 1 to 4 sets, meaning you're getting like almost
60, I believe it's 64%.
Yeah, like 64% and like 80 something percent from doing 1 to 4 and 5 to 9. So you're getting 2/3 of the gains with less than half of the volume, which I think is pretty wild when you think about it. And that should be an encouraging message to people who just don't have that much time, who aren't competitive bodybuilders, who are willing to get this really shitty ROI just to maximize their gains. And also, like you said, it's counting everything. So is 10 sets for chest high volume? Is 10 sets for triceps high volume when you're actually only need to do like 3 exercises for 3 to 4 sets a week to get there? Not really. So I think that's really good information. And then finally, individualizing volume. There's another study that highlights what I brought up earlier, that a mean response doesn't tell the whole story. And that is Scarpelli 2020. The title of it is Muscle Hypertrophy Response is Affected by Previous Resistance Training Volume in Trained Individuals. And this is getting into individualization. So what they did is they took one group and they just put them on a fixed number of sets, right? Regardless of what they had been doing previously. The other group, however, they increased their volume by 20% from whatever they had been doing based upon some surveys and questionnaires of asking them what they did. Now, the interesting part that I love about this study is the mean number of sets was the same in these two groups. The group that was given just a prescription for everybody, or the group that was given this 20% individualized increase. But the group that got the 20% increase got significantly better outcomes in terms of hypertrophy than the other group, even though the groups were doing the same amount of volume. So this kind of just reinforces my point earlier. So this tells us something about what is an appropriate level of increase in volume if, say, you are plateaued, and if you've identified in some type of, special needs analysis of what does this athlete need, that more volume might be the way I want to go. Okay, a incremental, non-huge increase in volume probably makes sense. If we're doing 10 sets, let's try 12 is what a 20% increase is, right? Not let's go to 20. Let's not double our volume. And I think that is really telling. It gives us some tools of what a reasonable increase is that should on average be better. It's not the end all be all. It's the start of, I think, more types of research designs we need to do. But it is really useful. And I think it is also telling that when you look at some of the research and you look at the standard deviations, you can see instances where people decreasing volume were still some of the top responders in a study. And it's difficult to really pick it out. But again, going back to that DeMoss study, some people will respond better to decreasing their volume. I mean, if you think about it logically, if let's say someone has been heavily influenced by the quote unquote volume camp, and by the time they came upon that content, they were already doing more volume than they were actually benefiting from. They can still recover from it, but like if there's this kind of middle zone where you're getting the same amount of gains, but you're just a little more beat up, and they're on the top end of that, but they're not progressing at the rate they think they should be, or maybe they are plateaued, and all they hear are these messages about doing more volume being better, they could increase their volume even more and actually be worse off, growing slower or perhaps even plateauing. And then if they said, you know what, I'm really confused, I'm going to hire Brandon as my coach, and Brandon goes, look, you're doing 40 sets per muscle group, let's try cutting you in half and see what happens. And maybe less than that, can you buy in or whatever, but let's just say they were like, yeah, let's cut it in half. It would not surprise me if they started actually growing from a large reduction in volume. And that can happen. It does happen. I view it quite regularly in my own coaching practice.
As do I. And there's a lot of times that it's what I'm doing is more of volume reallocation. So I kind of see volume as a budget, like total weekly volume as a budget. And just like we would, here's the really, the compare and contrast thing that I really find startling. We wouldn't tell all people that want to lose fat or want to gain muscle, you're to eat 3,000 calories per day, whether you're a 110-pound bikini competitor or you're a 200-pound, classic physique competitor. We wouldn't give them this prescription blanketed calorie amount that everyone has to eat to either gain muscle or lose body fat. It would be individualized. However, when it comes to volume, a lot of times people just put, they think they're following evidence-based practice, 10 plus sets per week. However, one consideration, this is something I've seen in my own practice, and I know it doesn't often get teased out in the literature. However, I don't think there's an ability to detect these things for the most part. But I think that we also have to consider that just because we have this threshold or this volume target, that doesn't mean that all muscle groups respond the same way to the same amount of volume. So for instance, I've seen in some of the literature, some of the evidence points to the fact that the lower body responds to higher volumes than the upper body. But I know in your case, you need less volume for your lower body than you do for your upper body. So if you were to go just based off what the evidence states, you would be doing the opposite. And you'd probably be taking away, because think about it, we only have so many resources, so many adaptive resources. And so if you were to follow just what the evidence states and you wouldn't take into consideration your own experiences and then, bouncing off ideas off of, say, Alberto and some of the guys within your team, you would say, all right, well, I'm going to do more volume for my legs, but now it's taxing your ability to recover. Now you can't, maybe you're still doing the same amount of volume or doing high volume for your upper body, but you're not responding as well to it because your legs are hyper responsive. However, you're taking away from the recovery resources that you can do elsewhere. You could allocate towards your upper body. But also we see in other, evidence, like other research, I believe it's Baz Val did a meta-analysis or maybe a systematic review this past year. I know that they pointed to 12 to 20 sets as being like, they consider that moderate volume. And that was where we saw the best hypertrophic outcomes for, I believe it was either the chest and I know it was quads for sure. It was one upper body body part and then also the quadriceps. However, for triceps, they saw 20 and above. However, a lot of people point to that and they're like, oh, we got to thrash our arms. But let's consider if we already did 12 sets directly for our chest, we already got, if pressing, we already got 12 sets for our triceps. So maybe that's only doing 8 additional direct sets for our triceps. So really what I've found to be the best practice is to allocate more volume to muscles that are lagging and utilizing more of a specialization cycle approach where I'll invest more of that total weekly budget that I was referring to towards a muscle where I'm aiming to bring up, and then I'll pull back on others to give up some of those adaptive resources from those strong body parts to areas that are lagging, so that everything's balanced throughout the course of the week. And it's not that every single body part needs 10 plus sets per week. Some may need less, some may need more based on your own individual response. But we also have to consider, all right, the research is a starting point, but now we have to individualize it towards that person, towards their psychological, what they like to do as well, but also what their response is like. And that's the big thing with coaching. It is about biofeedback. It is about customizing the program. Whereas, in many research studies, we can't do that, unfortunately. But I love that you hit on the Scarpelli study. That's been one of my favorite studies that's come out in the last 2 years, because it really did show, they had, I believe, about 19 subjects, and 10 of those subjects responded better to the 20%. So, 4 didn't see any difference. 5 saw a better response from the 22 set per week program. However, 10 of them, so the vast majority of them, saw a better response from that, taking their history. And that's what the first thing I do with a client is a needs analysis. So it's where have you been? Where are you currently? Where have you been? What has and has not worked for you? And what do you like to do? What do you have the time for? What do you have the desire to go into the gym? What is your schedule like? What are the constraints of your lifestyle? Without any of that, it doesn't matter if I create the optimal on paper program if it can't be implemented by the person I'm working with.
Fantastically said. I would add stuff to that, but I'd just be repeating what you said, Brandon. So no, I 100% agree. And yeah, there's a lot of things we do in practice where we try to use the evidence to guide us, but we probably do so more directly than we should. Like, it's a very common question I get in evidence-based circles of, okay, so how should I count a chest press for triceps? It probably makes more sense, and they cite some like EMG study or something like that, to count it as half a set, right? And I go, well, and then what are you basing the appropriate amount of volume on? Oh, like Schoenfeld 2017. I'm like, that's not how Schoenfeld 2017 counted. So if you want to use reference volumes based on the literature, you have to count it the same way as the literature. And they're like, but that doesn't make sense. I know that a chest press isn't effective for my chest or my triceps. And I go, and now you understand. Research is conceptual, and we have to apply it in a conceptual, not literal manner to what we're doing. If my triceps are stalled, I'm probably not going to do more bench. I might do, oh my God, more triceps. So that's the kind of way you have to start thinking about these things. And this also extends into the volume versus intensity discussion. A common feature that you'll see in the more volume-focused group is that because they are putting volume on a pedestal, they're happy to sacrifice proximity to failure in effort of getting more volume. So, well, I don't want to do, a 10 RPE on my first set because I want to be able to get, 5 sets of 10. And let's let that RPE kind of naturally climb. And I also want to be able to train in 2 days and hit the same muscle group again so I can accumulate all this volume. Now, I think that's a perfectly fine way to train. But there's a concession there which doesn't necessarily match the literature, which, like I said before, is primarily in people training to failure. And that's where we understand this volume relationship. And the same can be said of the folks in the intensity side, where they are potentially sacrificing volume by being really, really, really close to failure all the time or past it. And we don't necessarily know which way is worse or better. I was a part of a meta-analysis that got recently published by Ruffalo and colleagues. I'm on his PhD supervisory team. He's a great guy. He's also, competitor and a coach, very experienced, works out of JPS Health and Fitness in Melbourne. Big shout out there. And one of the things we did was that we identified different forms of failure. So momentary muscular failure, which is the idea that you're actually unable to complete the next rep. So you're mid concentric rep and you can no longer complete it. So you're actually failing. And the only way to properly do this in research is by not actually having a repetition target. You stop when you can't go anymore, versus other forms of failure, which might be a rep max, which is, hey, we established your 10 RM and we're going to use that load. And then when you can get more, we'll add load. So sometimes you're at failure, sometimes you're close, but it's, high intensity, but not necessarily failing.
Is it safe to kind of, I don't want to say label, but to kind of look at that as close to failure? We're training close to failure. We don't know if it's absolute failure.
Well, it really depends on what definition you like, because for most of my last 10 years, I've been happy to call getting the last rep you can get going to failure. But that's not momentary muscular failure. I would say the most objective definition that has the least amount of questions as to reliability and consistency is momentary failure. But I think it's important just to understand who you're talking to when you have these conversations. So like if you're talking to me and I'm thinking a 10 RPE, the most reps I could do, but not attempting the one I don't think I could do is failure, then we mean different things when we go to failure. And just like, Jeff, you had that eye-opening experience watching the video of what Arthur Jones was calling failure. It's like, oh shit, like failure
Completely
ain't
different
failure.
what I was seeing in the gyms. Yeah.
Yep,
Completely different.
exactly.
I came up in the time where 1,000 milligrams of test and 600 deca was kind of like a normal thing. And you just took a handful of Anadrol before you worked out. And that was the gym culture. But that was, you didn't see that training that matched that kind of drug use in the gyms. And that's when I kind of went like, well, maybe there is another way besides this over here that kind of meets somewhere in the middle for a better longevity aspect to the sport, because I think that that's something most people don't consider when they get into it. It's all gas, no brakes. I'm kind of like, well, kind of treat it like a manual transmission. You want to kind of run through your gears. You know what I mean? That was what I was able to put into context at an early age.
Absolutely. So Eric, going off of what you just said, it kind of brought a question, actually, a topic that I would like to bring up regarding proximity of failure. So just because we've been comparing, contrasting the intensity crowd, the volume crowd, and not that I need you to take either side. I know that you don't have a side in that debate. However, do you think that there is an inherent benefit of training to failure, or do you think that training to failure should be based on other factors? So let's consider someone's total weekly training volume, maybe their frequency of training. So how many times per week are they training that body part or that movement, say for a strength athlete? The movement, the type of exercise being performed. So are we looking at a compound? Are we looking at an isolation? Are we looking at a machine-based movement? Whether that actual exercise loads the lengthened or the shortened position, or if we're using high or low loads, because I think as from a coaching perspective, that's everything that's running through my mind. I'm saying, all right, I can never give you. So when someone asks me, if they ask me what the literature says, I'll say, generally 0 to 4 reps in reserve would be a general recommendation. However, with my own athletes, it's going to be dependent. If they ask me a question, what do you think? Do you think I should take this exercise to failure? Do you think I should take this session? I'm considering everything else, all the other variables. I can't isolate just training to failure because there's so many other considerations within programming itself. So volume training, volume, frequency, intensity, there's an interaction between all of them.
Yes, and I 100% agree with you. I think if we look at the literature on the most recent meta-analysis that I was part of, you see non-significant differences leaning in favor of trivial, maybe close to small effect sizes, favoring training to failure. The interesting thing, though, is they don't necessarily favor training as close to failure or to momentary failure. They don't go the way the intensity crowd would claim, is that the harder you train, the higher intensity, that's the key thing, the better. They actually are a little bit better for like velocity loss that is near failure, or other definitions of failure that aren't momentary. So training hard, but not as hard as is physically possible in any given moment.
I think the most telling thing, just to interrupt real quick, sorry. When you look at the forest plot, I think that's when you look, because you had 3 themes in that meta-analysis and systematic review. And when you look at the forest plot, it's really interesting because I believe, if I remember off the top of my head, theme A, I wish I had this pulled up, but theme A was momentary muscular failure. So it was momentary muscular failure. So you failed on an actual rep, on a concentric of a rep. You could not do anymore. If people are looking at the literature, we're talking like failure, like Steele and Fisher type failure. So we're taking it to the house. So when they compared momentary muscular failure versus non-failure, it actually was leaning more towards the middle, and when we look at diamonds. However, then when 100%. We look at non-failure versus set failure, meaning that could be volitional failure. That could be that the person ended their set because they felt that they had hit failure, but that doesn't mean actual true failure. It was leaning more towards that failure condition. And the same thing with the velocity loss. So I really, highly suggest you guys, if you aren't into reading studies, you only look at the conclusion, just go back. They have great graphs in that meta-analysis systematic review. It's Ruffalo 2020. Eric is the second author on that. I know that for a fact because I read through the entire thing. However, just go to the forest plot so you can just see, because that depiction just gives you more of it. It stands out strongly. Like you don't have to look through every study, but you could just see where it's leaning towards, and you'll see where the trends are favoring.
Exactly. Yeah. So you look at the overall results of the study and you see it's leaning towards failure, but then you look at the forest plot, like you're saying, it's a 0.12, which is a trivial effect size leaning towards momentary failure, but the p-value is like 0.34. And then when you look at the B, the part of the forest plot right below it, where we look specifically at set failure, which includes anything except momentary failure, and we've got a 0.077 p-value and a 0.27, an actual small effect size, not trivial, that's basically saying, oh, it actually seems like being close to failure, but not all the way at failure, might be a little bit better. But then finally, back to your original point, is that the vast majority of studies on failure versus non-failure training is 2 to 3 times per week. So all we can really conclude is that when you're training with a low frequency and a low volume, it's better to train pretty hard. Not necessarily as hard as you possibly and physically can, but it's better to train pretty hard. And another finding that we can state is true when we look at failure versus non-failure training of any type. And this is by a meta-analysis not too long ago by Vieira, and also something we highlighted in the discussion, and also the prior work that Martin's done, is that there is an increased recovery arc from training to failure. You're looking at basically 1 or 2 more days before you're getting back to baseline compared to non-failure training. And it's disproportionate because a lot of quote unquote non-failure training is still pretty close to failure. But you're looking at, indirect markers for muscle damage, fatigue, and also the suppression of force production, taking in basically on average an additional day before they come back to baseline, which a 2 to 3 times per week frequency, not a problem at all. But if we were to start doing studies where people are training 4, 5, or 6 times per week, which pretty much encapsulates 99% of bodybuilders and strength athletes, and we were going to train to failure, we start running into traffic. We start running into issues like, well, how do I recover in time to do that same muscle group or that volume from an indirect muscle group that was trained in what I took to failure if I'm training in that manner? And it forces you to do things like a bro split or an old school powerlifting approach where you're only doing bench, squat, and deadlift 1 day per week, and then you have like 1 accessory day. And we know that might be fine, but why would you limit yourself when we already established the importance of individual approach? So it's true that some people respond better to higher or lower volumes, and therefore it probably means that you need to scale the proximity to failure based upon where they respond for the volume, so you can get the most quote unquote out of that volume. And I think that's really what it comes down to. And you need to assess that, like you said, Brandon, on a muscle by muscle basis, and based upon the constraints, their time availability, their goals, and the time frame they have to achieve them. So yeah, all those factors are interplaying and interdependent as much as we try to be reductionist and separate them.
Absolutely. And the last thing I do want to hit on, because this is a conversation I often have with my clients, is it might be also not only volume dependent, it could be exercise dependent. So yes, I'm going to reserve going to failure. Maybe more so, I'm going to be more likely to have a client go to failure myself in an isolation movement or on a machine press or something of that sort, rather than a back squat. Because obviously there's a lot more detriments that could come from a injury perspective, and also so much more fatigue that's going to be induced by that. And also when we look at, and there's so much great research, I do definitely want to get you back on to look at stretch mediated hypertrophy, because I know you probably have your boot on right now with the calf stretching, but that's something I've been fascinated on. That's probably my favorite area of the literature that's really come to be very strongly advocated or strongly reinforced, at least for the biceps, the triceps, the quadriceps, and the hamstrings. As of right now, hopefully we get some chest and back literature going for it, so we have the full body and there's no debates between does a muscle respond to stretch or not, but we'll have to wait for that. But also looking, Eric, if you could expand a little bit further on your thoughts on whether we should maybe look at failure training also by where that movement overloads, so whether it be in the shortened or the lengthened position.
100%. Essentially, I think you need to balance the stimulus and the fatigue, which is often talked about kind of like in an exercise-based perspective, a la Dr. Mike. But I think that's actually a broader concept you need to think about. So if I'm going to do a bunch of volume on something, I mentioned earlier, maybe there should be some concession for the proximity to failure, since there's a disproportionate fatigue as I get close. And we get actually better benefits in the limited data we have being close, but not all the way at failure. So that is also true for other things. We know that if you were to take a exercise which trains a muscle at a longer versus a shorter length, not only does it have a greater stimulus, but it's also more likely to induce greater muscle damage. So that stretch has an effect there. So when you sit down and you start programming a microcycle, you need to consider all of the factors that are going to increase that recovery arc. So if I'm going to do more work, if I'm going to train closer to failure, and if I'm going to train at a longer muscle length, those are all things that I need to consider. And to your point, when you're using a compound lift, what is the limiting factor? And which muscles are actually going to be sore from that, which are getting trained at a longer muscle length? A really easy example for everybody that would be familiar with is an RDL, right? There is actually a little bit of knee extension in an RDL. You don't keep perfectly straight. It's not a stiff leg deadlift. You're going through like 10 degrees of knee extension at the top of an RDL, right? Are your quads ever sore after an RDL? Does it matter how many sets you do? No, but your glutes and hamstrings, which are stretched pretty damn far, are nuked after that exercise. And you have to think about, well, then when's the next time I'm training my glutes and my hamstrings? And to some degree, that's true for other exercises, but not to the same degree. So if I'm doing, say, a dumbbell lateral raise, I can kind of throw that anywhere so long as I'm recovered, but I don't have to worry about what comes after it. I don't have to worry about I could probably do a shoulder press the day after I do a dumbbell lateral raise. But now let's say you do a cable lateral raise with your arm behind your back in a stretch position where there's an immediate contraction because the cable is providing load, where in that position the dumbbell would not be because it's in line with gravity. Now you might actually find you get a little medial delt soreness after doing a behind the back cable lateral raise. That was something that I experienced. And you're wondering why. They're both lateral raises. Well, one is actually providing tension at a long muscle length and the other is not. So these are all factors that you have to consider that are going to influence your decision to train to a certain proximity to failure and with a certain volume that goes into everything else we talked about. So I think it's really important to make sure that any discussion of the programming variables for hypertrophy is one where, yeah, we take the pieces apart, we deconstruct it a little bit, we look at them in isolation with the research and we establish some guidelines. But then when we actually, the rubber hits the road, we sit down with our client, we have to integrate them all back together and think about how they impact one another before we make programming decisions.
Absolutely.
Well, Eric, man, I know you've got a hard stop, but thank you for joining us. And I really think we could really do another part two to this and really break it out even more if you're open to it. I'll let Brandon reach out and make that happen because I know you're a busy man. But thank you for joining us and taking the time. It was really, really cool to be able to chat with you again.
Always a pleasure. And I'm 100% down for coming back on. And I apologize that I can't stay for longer and chat with y'all.
No worries.
Dude, it's cool,
always
man.
Quality over quantity, my friend.
Yeah, it's quality over. That's what we try to keep them at an hour too. So we appreciate that. We just go longer for guests because we don't really bring many on. So thank you for joining us, man.
It's a pleasure.
Cool. Well, take care, dude.
All right, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. Well, B, man, I don't know about you. Before I'm going to hit pause and wrap this up, that was probably one of the coolest chats because we really touched on a lot. You know what I mean? Inside that 60 minutes, there was a lot that we really touched on that I think, made my mind go, okay, so I wasn't crazy for some of the stuff I thought. It's a lot of individuality, but there's some really good research showing that it's a matter of blending it to the individuality. And the way he really explains and breaks things down was just super. It's always informative, and that's why I love reading his books. So if you're listening and you're an audience member, go buy his books. They're really well written, and they make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and the exact reason I wanted to bring Eric on was because of that unbiased perspective, and he sees things from all ends of the equation, all sides of the spectrum. And so that's something I really appreciate. I try to do that with myself. We all have our own biases based on what has worked for us or what has worked with the thousands of clients we've worked with. But I find Eric to be such a gentleman, first and foremost, as a human being, but also as a practitioner, as a scientific deliberator of information. And so it's always great to get his opinion on things. He's able to go in such depth, but also make it, our whole goal is to provide clarity. And he's someone that can really, he's great at translational research. So I'm, really, happy that he was able to come on. I've been going back and forth with him for weeks about this. So he had been doing some travel. So I do appreciate him. I know his time is limited. However, we're definitely going to get a part 2 because we had, him and I had discussed off air, discussing frequency, intensity, which is essentially, some people will think about intensity as proximity to failure, but actually intensity in the literature is defined as your percentage of 1 rep max, or your relative load. So we wanted to go over that. I definitely want to go through some stretch mediated hypertrophy work, which is a recent development in the literature, some advanced training techniques, and then also some, frequency, or talking about training frequency, because there's some newer literature on that. But, another great episode, my man. Happy that we were able to have him on, and I'm looking forward to continuing this conversation.
Me too, man. Well, B, as always, where can everybody find you at real quick?
Guys, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram at @BrandonDeCruz_ or through email, which is bdecruzfitness@gmail.com. Also, guys, just a reminder, if you guys could like, comment, subscribe, we really appreciate that. We're trying to expand this podcast out further and further, and we really do appreciate all your feedback, the questions that we receive on a weekly basis, as well as the feedback that we get on the episodes. I actually got a ton of feedback on our previous episode, which was on post-meal walks, the science behind them. I really want to thank you guys. That's something I've been speaking about for years, but I really wanted to do a very specialized episode just on the benefits from like a metabolic health perspective, a digestion perspective, some of the other more nuanced topics that we haven't hit on. Generally I'm going to talk about energy flux or energy expenditure and some of the physical body composition benefits of walking, of increasing NEAT. But we went through a little bit of a different viewpoint this last week, and it was really highly or well received, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, I actually got a few questions because I guess that's been a topic out there in the space. And there are a few coaches who are kind of shitting on the idea of walking after meals and just being like, oh, it's to this, to that. And my comment was, there's fucking treadmill desks now. There's no reason that you can't be working from home or be in your office and have one. There's all these different things, but I could tell you from my standpoint, from someone who did it, from someone who has clients who do it, from someone who's like, hey, even 5 or 10 minutes better than no minutes. You know what I mean? So find what works best for your clients. Find what works best for you.
Exactly. I think a lot of people are highly opinionated when they haven't put it into practice. And I will only ever make a judgment or have a criticism publicly if I've implemented and tried it for myself. So I look at the literature, I implement it with myself, and then with various clients, I assess feedback, I look at biofeedback, I see their response, and I see, does it fit that individual and does it fit the vast majority of my clientele? When it comes to post-meal walks, guys, this is a low-hanging fruit, a very easy to implement intervention. I will say, got to give a shout out to my boy Anthony Scalza. Did get a treadmill desk this past week after listening to our episode. So I was, enthused to hear that, but it's not about that. You guys can literally do in the confines of your home. Say that you're working at home. I have a lot of clients that will say, well, it's cold out right now. I can't get out. Walk around your house for 5 minutes, go sweep your house, or run the
vacuum.
The vacuum. It's not about directly feeling like you don't have to get on a treadmill. Oftentimes I'll go up and down my stairs. And actually there's a researcher, Martin Gabala, who's done research studies on just having people in offices do 5 minutes of stair climbing. So really just going up and down the stairs instead of taking the elevator once per hour. And then also there's another intervention where they did it after meals, and they saw a better glycemic response in terms of 24-hour blood glucose regulation as a result of that low-hanging fruit of, 3 times per day during the course of your workday, go, climb the stairs. You have 2 or 3 flights of stairs, go up and down once or twice, and you're done. And so these are little things that we could implement. It's all about, implementing positive habits that are going to reinforce other things within your life that are going to benefit you, not only from a body composition perspective, but also from, like we alluded to on the last podcast, from a metabolic perspective, from a blood glucose control perspective, an insulin sensitivity perspective, a digestion perspective. So regardless of the benefits you're looking for or the constraints within your health or within your lifestyle, you could take 5 minutes and really, optimize some things as a result of that. So
I agree, man. I just look at it all like anyone nowadays is just trying to feed their own roost of marketing. And I'm just like, hey, I put it to use. I've had clients put it to use. If it's quote unquote sanity to walk around your house for 5 or 10 minutes and sweep and clean, well, I don't know what else to say. I got no good advice. So it is what it is. Careful who you get your medicine from out there is all I know. But B, man, as always, good joining with you guys. What Brandon said, share it, like it. Ask us questions. We're all for us. Please don't send us voice notes. Hard to listen to those. But my email is jeff@relentlessforever.com. If you're interested in getting a hold of me for coaching, and B, I'll catch you next week, dude.
Later.
Peace.